Leo Max Frank was born in Cuero, Texas, on April 17, 1884, to Rudolph Frank and Rachel Jacobs. When Leo was just 3 months old, the family relocated to Brooklyn. He attended public schools in New York City and graduated from Pratt Institute in 1902. He then went on to Cornell University, where he studied mechanical engineering and was a member of the H. Moore's Stevens Debate Club. After earning his degree in 1906, Frank briefly worked as a draftsman and testing engineer. In late October of 1907, at the invitation of his uncle Moses Frank, Leo traveled to Atlanta for 2 weeks to meet with investors for a job opportunity at the National Pencil Company, where Moses held a significant share. Frank accepted the offer and traveled to Germany to study pencil manufacturing at the Ebhard Faber factory. After completing a 9-month apprenticeship, Frank returned to the U.S. and started working at the National Pencil Company in August of 1908. By the following month, he was promoted to superintendent, earning $180 per month plus a share of the company's profits. Shortly after his arrival in Atlanta, Frank met Lucille Seelig, who came from a prominent upper-middle-class Jewish family. Her ancestors had founded the first synagogue in Atlanta 2 generations earlier. They married in November of 1910, and Frank later described his married life as happy. The Jewish community in Atlanta was the largest in the southern United States, and the Franks were part of a cultured and philanthropic community that enjoyed pastimes such as opera and bridge. Despite the fact that the South was not specifically known for its anti-Semitism, Frank's northern upbringing and Jewish background set him apart in the eyes of many. Mary Fagan was born on June 1, 1899, into a family of tenant farmers in Georgia. Her father passed away before she was born, and shortly after her birth, her mother, Frances Fagan, moved the family back to their hometown of Marietta. In or after 1907, they relocated again, this time to East Point, Georgia, a part of southwest Atlanta, where Frances opened a boarding house. At the age of 10, Mary left school to work part-time at a textile mill. In 1912, after her mother remarried John William Coleman, the family moved to Atlanta. That spring, Mary found work at the National Pencil Company, earning 10 cents an hour operating a knurling machine that inserted rubber erasers into the metal tips of pencils. She worked 55 hours a week, across the hall from Leo Frank's office. On April 21, 1913, Mary Fagan was laid off from her job due to a shortage of materials. On the afternoon of April 26, she returned to the factory to collect her pay. The following day, just before 3 a.m., the factory's night watchman, Newt Lee, went to the basement to use the restroom. After leaving the toilet, Lee discovered Fagan's lifeless body in the rear of the basement near the incinerator and immediately contacted the police. Her dress was raised around her waist, and a strip of her petticoat had been torn off and wrapped around her neck. Her face was blackened, scratched, and her head was severely bruised. A 7-foot length of wrapping cord was tied in a loop around her neck, indicating she had been strangled. Her underwear was still in place, but was blood-stained and torn. Her skin was covered in dirt and ash from the floor, leading initial responders to believe that Fagan had struggled with her attacker in the basement. A service ramp at the back of the basement led to a sliding door opening into an alley. Police discovered that the door had been tampered with, allowing it to be opened without unlocking it. Bloody fingerprints were found on the door, and a metal pipe, likely used as a crowbar, was also found at the scene. Some of the evidence was mishandled by the investigators. For instance, a trail of dirt along the elevator shaft, believed to be where Fagan had been dragged, was trampled, and the footprints were never identified. 2 notes were found near Fagan's head, which became known as the murder notes. Lee was arrested based on the notes and his apparent familiarity with the body. He had claimed that the girl was white, while the police initially thought she was black due to the darkness and filth in the basement. A trail leading to the elevator shaft suggested that the body had been moved by Lee. After initially arresting Newt Lee and a friend of Mary Fagan's, the police began to doubt their involvement. By April 28th, the police suspected the murder had occurred on the 2nd floor of the factory, near Leo Frank's office, after finding hair on a lathe and possible bloodstains. On April 27th, the police tried unsuccessfully to reach Frank, who seemed nervous when they later contacted him. He denied knowing Fagan at first, but agreed to accompany the police to the factory and morgue. After giving a deposition on April 28th and explaining his movements on the day of the murder, Frank was not considered a suspect at that point. However, Frank's nervous behavior and the discovery of a blood-smeared shirt led the police to focus their suspicion on him. He had hired Pinkerton detectives to investigate, but unbeknownst to Frank, one of them, Harry Scott, had close ties to the police and was biased against him. On April 29th, the police found the shirt and became convinced that Frank had planted it to mislead them. They arrested Frank on April 29th after building a case based on suspicions, including rumors that Fagan had been seen after she left the factory and a confrontation between Frank and Lee. On April 30th, a coroner's inquest was held, and while no conclusive evidence was found, witness testimony about Frank's behavior with women added to the suspicion against him. By May, further investigations from outside detectives, including the William J. Burns Agency, revealed frustration with the case's social and political implications, particularly the belief that Frank's wealth and status as a Jewish businessman may have influenced the investigation. On May 23, 1913, a grand jury convened to hear evidence against Leo Frank for the murder of Mary Fagan. Prosecutor Hugh Dorsey presented enough information for an indictment, assuring the jury that more details would be provided during the trial. The next day, the jury indicted Frank. Meanwhile, Frank's legal team suggested Jim Connolly, a black factory worker, was the real killer and pushed for a second grand jury to indict him, but Dorsey advised against it. The trial began on July 28, 1913, with a large crowd both inside and outside the courtroom. The prosecution, led by Dorsey, argued that Connolly's testimony about Frank's involvement in the murder and the murder notes was true. They presented evidence of blood stains and hair on the second floor of the factory to support their theory. The defense, led by Luther Rosser, argued that Connolly was the murderer, suggesting he had carried Fagan's body and written the murder notes with the help of Newt Lee, the night watchman. They disputed the significance of the physical evidence and provided an alibi for Frank. The defense also focused on the missing purse, suggesting Connolly had stolen it, and questioned Connolly's account of seeing Frank place the purse in a safe. Both sides disputed the significance of a torn pay envelope. Throughout the trial, the legal teams navigated the racial dynamics of a white man being tried based on the testimony of a black man, with the prosecution playing on racial prejudice to discredit Connolly's testimony. During the trial, the prosecution accused Leo Frank's legal team of attempting bribery and witness tampering. In response, the defense requested a mistrial, claiming that the jurors had been intimidated by the crowd inside and outside the courtroom, but the motion was denied. Fearing for the safety of Frank and his attorneys if the verdict were an acquittal, Judge Rowan and the defense agreed that neither Frank nor his lawyers would be present when the verdict was read. On August 25, 1913, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict, convicting Frank of murder. Following the verdict, the Constitution reported that Prosecutor Dorsey was carried triumphantly on the shoulders of 3 men as the crowd cheered and praised him. The following day, August 26, Judge Rowan sentenced Frank to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for October 10th. Frank's defense team publicly protested, arguing that public opinion had unfairly influenced the jury, a claim that was raised throughout the appeal process. Under Georgia law at the time, death penalty appeals had to focus on errors of law rather than re-evaluation of the trial evidence. The defense appealed, citing 115 procedural issues, including jury prejudice, intimidation by the crowd, and the admission of Connolly's testimony about Frank's alleged sexual activities. They argued that the verdict was based on improper evidence weighing. The prosecution countered with testimony from jurors supporting the original trial. On October 31, 1913, Judge Rowan denied the appeal, stating that although he was unsure of Frank's guilt or innocence, the jury had been convinced and there was no reason to doubt their verdict. On December 15, 1913, Frank's defense presented arguments before the Georgia Supreme Court, focusing on Judge Rowan's expressed doubts and the issue of jury prejudice. The prosecution countered, asserting that the conviction was supported by strong evidence. On February 17, 1914, the court denied Frank a new trial, dismissing claims of bias and ruling that Connolly's testimony about Frank's alleged sexual conduct was admissible. In March of 1914, Frank's execution was scheduled for April 17th, but the defense filed an extraordinary motion leading to a stay of execution and a hearing on April 23rd. New affidavits were presented, including one from a biologist disputing the hair evidence. The defense argued that Frank's absence during the verdict violated his due process rights. Despite the defense's efforts, the court upheld its decision. Frank's appeal was rejected, and the decision was upheld on November 14, 1914. Frank's legal team appealed the issue of his absence during the verdict announcement through the federal system. Initially, both Justice Joseph Rucker Lamar and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. denied the request, agreeing that the issue was raised too late. The Supreme Court later heard arguments but denied the motion without a written decision. Holmes expressed doubts about the fairness of the trial, citing the hostile crowd presented during the trial. Encouraged by Holmes' statement, Frank's team filed a habeas corpus motion, arguing that the threat of violence had forced Frank to be absent from the verdict hearing, violating his due process rights. On April 19, 1915, the Supreme Court denied the appeal by a 7-2 vote in Frank v. Mangum. Holmes and Charles Evans Hughes dissented, with Holmes asserting that lynch law should not be valid whether practiced by a mob or a jury. On April 22, 1915, a commutation request for Frank's death sentence was submitted to the Georgia Prison Commission, but it was rejected by a 2-1 vote on June 9th. The dissenter felt the execution was unjust, considering the crime circumstances and the testimony of an accomplice. The case then moved to Governor Frank Slayton, whose term was ended shortly after Frank's scheduled execution. Slayton, who had a law partnership with Frank's lead attorney, Luther Rosser, faced criticism, including accusations of a conflict of interest. Slayton held hearings on June 12th, reviewing evidence and documents, including over 10,000 pages and receiving more than 1,000 death threats. He visited the crime scene and was warned by former Governor Joseph Brown about the consequences of overturning the trial. Slayton's report, which included a defense of the trial and the verdict, shifted to question whether Jim Connolly, the key witness, was truthful. Slayton expressed doubts about Connolly's account, particularly regarding the movement of the body and the murder notes, which influenced his decision. The public was furious, with a mob threatening to attack Governor Slayton at his house. A detachment of the Georgia National Guard, along with local police and some of Slayton's friends who were sworn in as deputies, successfully dispersed the crowd. Slayton, once a popular governor, and his wife quickly fled Georgia afterwards. For Frank's safety, he was secretly moved to the Milledgeville State Penitentiary the night before the commutation was made public. The penitentiary, located 150 miles from Marietta, was heavily fortified and well armed. The commutation of Frank's death sentence on June 21, 1915, led Tom Watson to publicly advocate for Frank's lynching. In the Jeffersonian and the Watson magazine, Watson declared, "Lynch law is a good sign. It shows that a sense of justice lives among the people." A group of influential men formed a vigilance committee and openly plotted to kidnap Frank from prison. This group included 28 men with various skills, such as an electrician to cut the prison wires, car mechanics to keep the cars running, and even a hangman. Some of the prominent members were Joseph Mackey Brown, former governor of Georgia, Eugene Herbert Clay, former mayor of Marietta, and others. On the evening of August 16th, the lynch mob, consisting of 8 cars, traveled from Marietta to Milledgeville, where they arrived around 10 p.m. They cut the prison telephone wires, drained the gas from the prison cars, handcuffed the warden, seized Frank, and drove off. The 175-mile journey took about 7 hours. They stopped at Frey's Gin near Marietta, where Frank was hanged from a tree around 7 a.m. The crowd included men, women, and children, some of whom cut pieces of Frank's shirt as souvenirs. One onlooker, Robert E. Lee Howell, urged the mob to mutilate Frank's body further. Judge Newton Morris intervened and arranged for the body to be taken away to prevent more violence. In Atlanta, it is estimated that 15,000 people filed past Frank's body in a makeshift viewing at the Undertaker's parlor. The body was then transported by train to New York, where Frank was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Glendale, Queens on August 20th, 1915. After Lucille Frank's death, she was cremated and buried next to her parents, not with Leo.